That's a nice feeling. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce my friend and former colleague, Charlie Lesch, who is doing something when we talk about Ufaratsta, that Jewish philosophy should spread beyond the boundaries of medievalism and into philosophy itself and into, in his case, political philosophy. It's a great, please sit down and be comfortable, everybody. Uh, Charlie Lesch was our colleague here at Vanderbilt for 3 years. He was here with his wonderful family, and they have made Aliyah. He is now teaching at what is sometimes described as the last great German university, which is the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. I was privileged to be there in December to partake in a conference that Charlie organized. It was also Zev Harvey, whom you have seen and heard on our broadcast and our Zoom cast, and he has published a wonderful book which grew out of his doctoral dissertation. I read it in manuscript, and it was published by Oxford University Press. It's a book on solidarity, which is a great issue in political philosophy, and I warmly recommend it. It has a broad historical scope, as it should, and leads to a conclusion about the centrality of Jewish thinking in resolving some of the seemingly irresolvable problems of political philosophy. He has a new book now about what he calls somewhat misleadingly theocracy, but theocracy, as he understands it, is not clerisy. It is not the rule of clerics, which we have some bad examples of going on today, but rather the deference to divine will. He has recreated, reconstituted, rehabilitated that idea in a way that is authentically Jewish and authentically in the great tradition of Western political thinking, of which he is a paramount exemplar in our day. It was a great privilege for me to take part in a conference at the Hebrew University in December, which Charlie and his colleagues organized, and it's wonderful to be able to welcome him back here to his own old stomping grounds at Vanderbilt, and to see how many buildings we have built since you left, and the progress that we have made. It's my pleasure, privilege, and honor to introduce my colleague and friend, Charlie Lesch.
Well, thank you so much for those kind words. Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to add just a personal note to what's already been said many times today, and that is the remarkable, magnificent achievement of Lennon Phil's translation. I had the amazing good fortune, might say providence, I don't know, to get a first glimpse of this translation when I was teaching at Vanderbilt. Len shared copies with me of the proofs. He used to read it next to him at shul. And I'll just say that the experience of reading it was just utterly transformative for me, both intellectually and personally. I'm just privileged to have been among the first to learn from it, and I'm truly honored and grateful to Len for inviting me to participate in this event today. Now, a word about my talk today, which is about messianism in Maimonides, and Maimonides' making of the Messiah. Apparently, there's this psychiatric term, although I don't think it's an official medical diagnosis. It's called Jerusalem syndrome. Maybe you've heard of that. The basic idea is, there's someone who moves to Israel, specifically someone who moves to Jerusalem, and within a few years, he starts to think that he's the Messiah. The city just seems to have that effect on people, right? So, as someone who himself moved to Jerusalem not so long ago, I knew that this was a danger. You'll be relieved to hear that I don't think that I am myself the Messiah. Uh, yeah, strict boss. However, and at the risk of seeming a little crazy, I do think I figure out where we can find him. And that I want to suggest is in Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed. That is to say, I wanted to argue that among Maimonides' aims in writing the guide, not the only aim, but perhaps one of the most important aims, was to both identify and train the Messiah. It's a book, in short, designed to bring about the Messianic age. Now, I recognize that this is a dramatic claim, and I imagine that for many of you that would be a fairly radical claim. Most readers of the guide fall broadly into two camps. On one hand, there are those who, following Maimonides' own words, hold that the guide was written primarily to accomplish a kind of intellectual reconciliation, right, to psychologically harmonize a person who's perplexed by apparent contradictions between the Torah and philosophy. On the other hand, readers who follow Leo Strauss's view contends that the guide is exoterically Jewish, but esoterically Greek, right? It appears superficially to erect a bulwark around the Torah and defend religious piety, but actually it passes on a coded message among the philosophical elite, from Plato through Al-Farabi, who understand that if you want to protect the philosophic life, you have to have obedience by the masses. These are kind of the two views, right? Now, I think the first view is correct, but I also think it's incomplete. Maimonides is writing for such a perplexed individual. But I want to make the case that he's more interested in making leaders than in cultivating inner harmony for its own sake. As for the second view, I think it's mistaken about the guide's ultimate aims. But I do think that it is correct in reading the guide both as a political text and a political text whose political nature is indebted above all to Al-Farabi, to the philosopher Al-Farabi. So I'm going to do my best in the time I have this afternoon to give over the substance of this argument. Now, methodologically, making this argument is challenging, given that Maimonides, unsurprisingly, never comes out and says that he wants to train the Messiah. So what I want to do is offer a kind of two-pronged hermeneutic. First, I want to show that the argument follows logically and follows textually. There are certain concepts like prophecy and providence and knowledge, which are defined by Maimonides in the guide. What we can do is we can go back and see how those definitions change our reading of what Maimonides says throughout his writings, most notably in the Mishneh Torah. And then second, the paper roughly follows the order of reading of Maimonides that I think a potential Messiah might take. And when we do that, I think it becomes possible to grasp how an individual might start to see himself in this way over time. Okay, so my argument has 5 parts, and I'm going to try to give them over, as it were, from the perspective of this potential Messiah. All right, so the first thing our potential Messiah does is he reads the chapter in the Mishneh Torah on kings and their wars. And I think Maimonides has 4 aims in this tractate. He wants to prepare or prime the Jewish public to support potential messiahs of the right kind, while reject imposter messiahs. Second goal, he wants to inspire select individuals to become the Messiah or make the attempt. Third goal, he wants to naturalize the Messianic age and bring it into ordinary human history. And then finally, he wants to align the purpose of the Messianic age with what he takes to be humanity's highest end, its highest purpose, which is knowing God. Okay, so how does our potential Messiah read it? Well, to begin with, he finds a depiction of the Messiah who's a human being through and through. He does have to be of the Davidic line, and he is, it seems, a great military leader and a teacher, but he's not called upon to perform miracles. He's born, he dies, like any other person. Moreover, and importantly, Maimonides more or less explicitly condones individuals who try to become the Messiah but fall short in some way, like Bar Kokhba, right? Maimonides says about such individuals that they should be remembered as righteous kings of Israel, right? And this is a way of encouraging other peoples to try. If you don't make it, you're still remembered well. On the Messianic age itself, likewise, Maimonides offers a fully naturalized account. He brings it into history. The laws of nature won't change. The Torah itself, or at least the written Torah and the oral law, will not change. The exiles will be gathered in. The temple will be rebuilt. Israel's enemies will be defeated, and knowledge of God will spread throughout the world. Okay. Now, this last point is especially critical because what Maimonides means by knowledge of God, we know from the guide, is characterized above all by philosophy. Now, Maimonides does divide between the elites and the masses in the Messianic age. And this distinction matches what we know from the guide also. So Maimonides, following Plato, argues that those who are philosophically adept, those are the ones who can acquire real knowledge, right? For everyone else, true beliefs are enough. That is, for most people, it's enough that ideas are correct, even if their rational basis is not known by the one who possesses them, like the Icarian. Right? So the Messianic age will be one in which philosophy, or its creedal equivalent for the masses, has spread throughout the world in some form. Okay. Now, importantly, our potential Messiah doesn't necessarily know that last part yet. He may not have read the guide. So he may not know about the crucial place of philosophical knowledge for the Messianic age. But what he does, though, or see, is that none of the things that the Messiah has to do, according to Maimonides, are beyond a person's grasp. He could do them, assuming he's a descendant of David, right? And that, I think, is, again, what Maimonides wants. He wants people to be inspired to make the attempt, to take an active role in history. There's a well-known letter Maimonides wrote to the Jews of Provence on astrology, where he wrote, referring to astrology, quote, "This is why our kingdom was lost, our temple destroyed, and why we were brought to this pass. Our fathers sinned and are no more, for they did not study the art of war or conquest, but fancied those arts," meaning astrology, "would help them." But there's a caveat here. Imagine that a charismatic and religiously pious but unphilosophical person is inspired by Maimonides, and he fights for Israel's independence. And let's say that he succeeds. It is likely that the state that he'll establish will be devoted to religious goals, but not to the pursuit of philosophical truth. In fact, such a state might be hostile towards philosophy, right? Regarding it, as did most of Maimonides' contemporaries, as dangerous and foreign and antithetical to the Torah. So there's a sense, therefore, in which such a condition would actually be worse than exile. Israel will falsely believe that it has been redeemed, right? And it will define its core aims and values in an anti-philosophical way. It'll be like the religiously learned but philosophically ignorant man in the famous parable of the palace, right, in Maimonides' guide, that the nation will find itself with its back turned towards God, even if it thinks that it's found, God's inner chamber, right? So this is a problem, that the worry is that the Messianic age will take the right form, but it will be hollowed of its real substance. So Maimonides, of course, thinks that Israel's independence, rebuilding the temple, and gathering the exiles, that these are all important goals. But they are primarily means, right? As we know from the guide, knowledge of God via philosophy is the highest end. So this is Maimonides' problem. How can he ensure that not just any ambitious person, but specifically a philosopher, try to become the Messiah? Put another way, how can he clear the ground for a Messianic age characterized not only by these conventional political and religious objectives, but by true beliefs and by philosophical contemplation? So Maimonides' answer, I think, was to stress that the Messiah is not only a king in the line of David, but also a a prophet akin to Moses. He wants to compare the Messiah to Moses. He does this in Hilchot Tshuva, as well as in his epistle to Yemen. And what I do in the second part of this paper is examine this comparison. So that's where I'm going to turn now. Let me just start by just mentioning briefly this kind of Moses-Messiah comparison itself. I think today, the comparison between the Messiah and Moses is one that's widely accepted, more or less taken for granted. But that is largely because Maimonides himself is responsible for pressing the comparison. In Maimonides' own time, the association was nearly unprecedented, at least as far as I've found. There's no explicit biblical passage which connects the two, nor do either the Babylonian or Jerusalem Talmuds. In fact, in the Bavli's lengthy discursus on Messianism in Sanhedrin, the rabbinic sages emphasized the Messiah's identity as another David, right? There really isn't a mention of Moses. There are a handful of midrashic passages, post-Talmudic midrashic passages, which propose a kind of connection between Moses and the Messiah, but even those sources, notably, never grants the Messiah any prophetic powers along the lines of Moses. That doesn't come up in any of these midrashim. Okay, so I think we've established that this link between Moses and the Messiah is very original. It's deliberate on Maimonides' part, something he wants to stress. How does that solve the problem? How does it ensure that the Messianic age is going to be favorable to philosophy? Why would that happen? So, like this. On the one hand, comparing the Messiah to Moses should stop an ambitious but non-philosophical person from trying to become the Messiah. No person, or at least no sane person, will think that they're a prophet like Moses, right? And as we know, there were many messianic imposters in Maimonides' day, continue to be messianic imposters. There have been throughout human history, right? So when an unqualified person reads the Mishnah Torah, as Maimonides thought all pious Jews would do, what he'll find when he reaches Hilchot Tshuva is a description of the Messiah that should be enough to throw him off. He'll read there, as Maimonides writes, quote, because the king who will arise from the seed of David will possess more wisdom than Solomon, will be a great prophet, approaching Moses, our teacher. He will teach the whole of the Jewish people and instruct them in the way of God. Now, the guide, as we're going to see, allows us to read this passage a little bit differently, read it in a new light. But Maimonides thought, likely, that a non-philosopher would just stop there. He would say, okay, I think my path is barred. I can't go any further. But let's say that this aspiring Messiah, despite being unqualified for philosophy, decides to pick up the guide. There's another risk. He might be clever enough to parrot philosophical ideas without actually completing the rigorous program required in order to acquire true knowledge. And Maimonides has to defer this person to. And I think this helps to explain the guide's form, style, and kind of esotericism. Maimonides assumes that the reader will already, in his words, be, quote, engaged in philosophical studies and grasped their import. Right? And this includes both ancient thinkers like Plato and Aristotle and Plotinus, and also modern thinkers like Avicenna and Al-Farabi. Moreover, Maimonides is careful to note that the guide will only allude to, but not fully flesh out, crucial but controversial concepts. Among them, in Maimonides' own language, the meaning of prophecy and its degrees. And this is the upshot. Someone who picks up the guide, but has little knowledge of philosophy, aside from the guide, won't be able to follow its arguments to their full fruition. Let me say what I mean by that. Again, we're focusing here on this unphilosophical person who's aspiring or thinks that he might be the Messiah. Okay. So, if he picks up the guide, what might he learn that would encourage him? Well, to begin with, he'll learn that prophecy is, quote, an emanation flowing from God by way of the active intellect. He'll learn that true knowledge is acquired through reason rather than through tradition. And he'll see that the highest goal should be the intellectual apprehension of God. Okay, so far so good. Right? You might think he could become a prophet. The road to becoming a prophet is open. He's just got to work hard and develop his mind, right? What's stopping him? Okay. But when it comes to Moses, Maimonides' words are going to stop him in his tracks. Why is that? Maimonides is crystal clear that Mosaic prophecy was utterly unique, peerless. He insists that his main chapters that address prophecy, quote, say not a word directly or implicitly about it. Moses is just a different category, right? Moses' prophecy, he writes, was, quote, beyond that of the patriarchs, quote, unmediated by the imagination. And for proof, he quotes the Torah from Deuteronomy, quote, no prophet will again arise in Israel like Moses, whom God knew face to face. Okay, well, that would seem to be game over for the aspiring Messiah, right? If the Messiah has to be like Moses, as Maimonides seems to imply, then this unqualified candidate will find no comfort in the guide, right? The book is going to close his messianic ambitions. That's it. Okay. But let's say that our potential Messiah was learned in philosophy. Let's say in particular that he's read his Al-Farabi, which Maimonides really assumed of anyone who was picking up the guide. And from Al-Farabi, he's learned that actually prophecy, even in its highest form, is identical with philosophy. Revelation is not something magical. It's just the religious idiom that we use when we describe philosophically emanation from the divine being, right? Someone who's reached the highest level intellectually enters into a kind of fusion with the Aristotelian active intellect. His mind can participate in the divine mind. His thoughts can be identified in some sense with God's thoughts. Now, Maimonides never spells this out explicitly in the guide, although he does allude to it in a few places. But I think, even so, the implication should be clear. Moses' prophecy was not distinguished by some special act of divine will or some other kind of mysterious quality. It is simply a supreme cognitive achievement. And what's the upshot? What is our aspiring Messiah going to say? He'll realize that any person can, in fact, reach an intellectual height equal to that of Moses. In principle, there is nothing to block a given individual, assuming he was blessed with the right natural abilities and worked hard, from summiting the same intellectual pinnacle. In fact, it's striking that nowhere in the guide, at least that I can find, does Maimonides actually make a logical argument for the uniqueness of Mosaic prophecy. I'm open to being corrected, but nowhere I can find does he make a logical argument for the uniqueness of Mosaic prophecy. The closest he comes is to argue for the Torah's perfection, right? What does he say about the Torah? Says the Torah seeks to improve the soul and not merely the body. The Torah strikes the proper balance between extremes in its demands and concessions to ancient norms. The Torah aims to bring Israel to knowledge of God. Fine, okay. Let's say we grant all of those points. They're hardly dispositive. Imagine that a different philosopher prophet were to arise, right, at another time and place. There is no principled reason why the law code that he bestows might not have the same qualities that Maimonides just ascribed to the Torah, right? He just apply it to a different people. In fact, I think it's telling that the main way that Maimonides defends the singularism of Mosaic prophecy in the guide is by appealing to tradition. He says things like, the Torah attests, or that is why our scripture can tell us, or our scriptures and traditions clearly show, and so on and so forth. So to sum up, our potential Messiah should now see that the philosophical stature of Moses can, in fact, be in his reach. Okay, so I'll turn now to the third part of the paper. So our potential Messiah should now have all that he needs to recognize himself, right? Or at least to see that he is the intended pupil of the guide, potentially. He still might hesitate, though. He might say, okay, well, let's say that I succeed, right, as the Messiah. Something would still seem off. I didn't perform any miracles. God didn't speak in my ear, right? The Messiah is supposed to be sent by God, but I just made myself. Can I still be God's agent, right? What would this even mean, right? Or am I just some kind of clever pretender? So I think that he'll find answers to those questions in the guide as well. For just as Maimonides reconceives of prophecy, he also reconceives of providence. General providence is the work of God for Maimonides, right? It's manifest in the cosmological design, planetary cycles, the seasons, what we would today refer to as natural laws. Individual providence, by contrast, is the fruit of our own labor. When a person sufficiently cultivates his mind, Maimonides says, his actions, like his thoughts, are not merely his own, they're tethered in some way to the active intellect and thereby to God. So they can be interpreted. His actions can be interpreted in some way simultaneously as God's actions. And that's really crucial because now it actually follows logically to define our aspiring Messiah, if he's a philosopher, as being sent by God. As a philosopher, he's developed his rational faculties to the greatest possible extent. And when he acts according to these faculties, therefore, his actions can be conceived of as God's actions. There's no contradiction at all in the Messiah both making himself and also being seen as a divine agent. In fact, let's say that our aspiring Messiah decides to flip back to Hilchot Melachim. There he would see that Maimonides, I think very tellingly, when he describes the Messiah's advent, he fails to mention God at all. What does Maimonides say? In the future, the Messianic king will arise. La'amod. Right? But let's say that our aspiring Messiah still needs reassurance. In that case, he might also look to the guide's conclusion. This is Book 3, Chapter 54. Now, it should be said, Maimonides never addresses Messianism in this chapter directly. In fact, I think he only rarely refers to either the Messiah or the Messianic age throughout the guide. But the book's concluding passages plainly address, I think, future leaders of Israel. And they strongly hint that one such leader might become the Messiah. So let's take a look. To begin with, Maimonides in this chapter reminds readers of the form that God's providence takes on earth, human actions in light of divine reason. Maimonides had just explained in chapter 53 that what providence like this looks like in practice is the imitation of God, in particular divine attributes of chesed, mishpat, and tzedakah, this say kindness, justice, righteousness. Fine. But it's important to know that these attributes, again, chesed, mishpat, and tzedakah, are not only or even primarily moral attributes. They are, as Maimonides states clearly, political ones. They are attributes of rule. As he writes, quote, the human attainment rightly gloried in clearly is to reach, so far as one can, an awareness of God and his care for his creatures, giving them being and ruling them, as he does. Maimonides here is referring to his earlier elucidation, which is in Book 1, Chapter 54, of when Moses requested to know God, and God responded. And this is traditionally referred to as God's 13 attributes. By imitating those attributes, Moses was able to translate his knowledge of God into insights for governing others, says Maimonides. As he wrote there, quote, "One who governs a state, if a prophet, must emulate God's attributes to ensure that his actions as a leader are appropriate." So we can see that the main human rationale to know and imitate God is not personal, it's political, or perhaps better, political philosophical. A person who maximally develops his intellect earns not only powers of prophecy and providence, he gains insight into how to govern other people. Fine. But now the question is, who is this future ruler? Who is this person who at a minimum has made it all the way through the guide? No easy feat for many people, right? And more ideally, has assimilated the guide's core lessons about God and about philosophy and about leadership. Who is this remarkable man who is propelled by a divine providence that he has himself achieved, is going to model his rule on God's rule? I think we can see the answer if we look closely at the concluding passages of the guide. Maimonides, you might recall, began the guide by talking about Israel's exile. It's Israel's exile, he explained, that justified his, quote, committing to writing, for his words, one outstanding person, truths which have been prescribed as dangerous for mass consumption. It's exile which gave him the same warrant held by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi when he broke the ban on transcribing the oral law. And it's exile which implanted the false belief that philosophy is, quote, foreign to our Torah. And I think it's very significant, therefore, that Maimonides also chooses to end the guide with Israel's exile. But there's a difference. The tide seems to be turning. The book concludes with two passages from Isaiah, each of which speak to the promise of redemption. So here are those passages in Maimonides. "Then shall the eyes of the blind be opened, and the ears of the deaf be unstopped." That's from Isaiah 35. "And then the people that walked in darkness shall see a great light, and those who live in the land of the deep gloom, a light shall dawn." That's from Isaiah 9. Okay, now, Maimonides clearly intends the reader to interpret these metaphors from Isaiah of seeing, right, and light in philosophical terms. They're about converting ignorance into wisdom. But Maimonides also knew that the prophet in context was not extolling knowledge for its own sake. He was describing the Messianic age. And Maimonides no doubt anticipated that astute readers would follow Isaiah 35 to the conclusion of the chapter. And this is what Isaiah writes at the end of 35. And "And God's ransomed will return and come with shouting to Zion, crowned with joy everlasting. They shall attain joy and gladness, while sorrow and sighing flee." So Maimonides justified writing the guide because of Israel's exile. By concluding this way, I think he implies that studying the guide will hasten redemption. Reading the guide, in other words, will itself bring about Messiah. Okay. So let's turn back now to our potential Messiah. I think he'll hear this message too. And now that he suspects his true identity, he might turn for confirmation to the most important letter Maimonides composed on messianism, his epistle to Yemen. And there he'll find something striking. Maimonides in the epistle describes the Messiah by citing the very same chapter of Isaiah, which he concludes the guide with, this time in order to describe the Messiah's attributes. It's conspicuous, moreover, that these attributes of the Messiah closely track the model of leadership that Maimonides will later describe in the guide. So what does Maimonides say? Maimonides says the Messiah will be, in his words, strong, defined as the ability to control one's passions, rich, meaning wealthy in knowledge, and with having a transcendent wisdom, which we know by now, Maimonides means, following Al-Farabi, refers to a fully actualized intellect. Okay. Maimonides also compares the Messiah, as he later will in Hilchot Tshuva, to Moses. He calls him a very eminent prophet, more illustrious than all the prophets after Moses. Okay. So to sum up, what we have here, I think, is a kind of messianic entrance exam. Only those who are philosophically serious, only those who've completed the curriculum that Maimonides stresses is a prerequisite for studying the guide, will be positioned by its conclusion to make the required inference about Moses and about themselves. Moses was remarkable, but not peerless. Another person could be a similar philosopher and leader. But, and importantly, this is not a conclusion someone could have reached by reading the guide alone. He will have to have studied philosophy, and Al-Farabi in particular. Okay, so our reader should now see his true potential. He could redeem Israel. Yet discerning this message is only the beginning, because now he needs to act on it. He has to bring Israel and the rest of humanity to philosophical knowledge of God. So to figure out how, I also think that his textbook will be the guide. And that's the fourth part of my paper. All right. So I think Maimonides intended the guide to teach the Messiah four main things. First of all, true philosophers are best suited to rule. This follows from the meaning of rulership. For Maimonides, like Plato and Al-Farabi, the right to rule derives from the ruler knowing better than the ruled what their proper end should be and the means to realize it. The greatest possible end, as we've already seen, is a mind that's fused with the divine mind. Now, that's an individual achievement, but individuals are not islands. The possibility of one or more people realizing their telos or just kind of dancing towards it, moving towards it, depends on the conditions of their surrounding society. Maimonides alludes to this idea when he interprets the story of Jacob's ladder in terms of Plato's cave parable. So in Maimonides' words, quote, "How fitting that it says, ascending and descending. Ascent first, after rising to a certain rung comes descent with what was gained to govern and teach those on earth." Okay. So the ideal ruler thus has two key traits. First, he's fully actualized his intellect. And then second, he sees in himself the capacity to help others to do the same. Now, as we've seen, this ruler is also a prophet. So the most important means that he has at his disposal is revealed law. This is Maimonides' second lesson for the Messiah. Revealed law, like prophecy in its highest form, derives from philosophy. It doesn't rely on some magical form of divine intercession, but instead it originates from the human intellect at its zenith. Parallel here is with individual providence, right? So when a person acts, again, from his rational faculties, he can be called God's agent. Likewise, when a philosopher, a true philosopher, legislates, we can say that God himself is legislating. And what does that mean about the law? The law is divine. Okay. Now, Maimonides also needs to teach our aspiring Messiah the obstacles that stand in the way of Israel and the rest of humanity gaining knowledge of God. This is the guide's third lesson for him. First of all, Maimonides assumes that only a unified society can grow in knowledge of God. So how can we achieve that kind of unity? It's question one. Second, even though philosophy has ends which are universal, human groups are particular. They're different, right? They vary based on their context. So how can it be that philosophy's truths be tailored for individual national groups? And then finally, human beings vary in their intellectual capabilities. Is there a way to distill or translate philosophy's insights in a way that everyone can access? So this leads to the fourth and final lesson that I see for the Messiah and the guide, which are techniques that the Messiah might use to surmount these various obstacles. Okay, so what are these techniques? They're what Al-Farabi describes as the ruler's kingly craft. This is not a term that Maimonides himself never uses. He also never explicitly names these techniques of rule. But when we look closely at how Maimonides portrays Moses' leadership in the guide, we look at how he looks at Moses as a leader, I think it's pretty clear that he's painting with Al-Farabi's brush. So what are the techniques? One of them is what Al-Farabi calls deliberative virtue or prudence. Prudence is the means by which a ruler can make laws which gently lead his people to philosophical knowledge. The key idea here is that the ruler can't just legislate philosophy, right? He has to take into account his people's time, their context, their characteristics, their development. For Maimonides, the Torah's clearest example of this is Moses using prudence when he decides to establish a sacrificial cult. Very famous. We already talked about this today to some degree. Now, animal sacrifice is an inferior form of religious expression, but human beings are slow to change. And God, Maimonides emphasizes, is not going to magically transform human nature. So just as a newborn cannot digest solid food, but first needs milk, so too, Maimonides emphasizes, Israel needs to be gradually raised to a kind of spiritual adulthood, right? To prayer, and then even more ideally to philosophical contemplation. Okay, so that's prudence. A second technique of rule that Al-Farabi describes is imagination, which he defines as, quote, persuasion and representing things through images. Okay. How does that work? For Maimonides, as we know, truths about God are won through the study of logic, mathematics, the sciences, and philosophy. Fine. But many human beings are not suited for that curriculum. They can arrive at such truths on their own, and consequently, those truths have to be conveyed by other means. That's what the imagination is for. So to illustrate, I'll use what's probably Maimonides' most famous example, which is divine reward and punishment. It goes like this. In reality, as we talked about, individual providence is something that we earn as people through reason. God does not miraculously strike down sinners or aggrandize saints. Okay. This idea, however, is destabilizing for many pious people. It's also difficult to understand. Those who don't have a philosophical education, a number who do, will have a hard time grasping the Neoplatonic metaphysics of elevating one's minds to achieve divine emanation via the active intellect. Okay. So for them, the ruler creates a kind of image or simulacrum of the truth. These are true beliefs. In this case, the belief in divine reward and punishment. For many people, these beliefs will substitute for real knowledge. Okay. So I think Maimonides plainly intends for the Messiah to model himself after Moses. But if that's right, there's a puzzle here that we have to unravel. Moses legislated a revealed law, the Torah. And based on what I've argued today, there's nothing in principle which should stop the Messiah from doing the same thing. As a philosopher of the same stature as Moses, he should be entitled to modify, augment, or even replace the Torah entirely, based on his judgment about whether the text continues to meet the needs of that age. But Maimonides, as we all know, vehemently rejects this idea, right? He insists that not only the written Torah, but also the oral law has not changed and will never change, even in the Messianic age. So what does this say about Maimonides' Messiah? That's the question I take up in the last part of this paper. And what I argue is that even though the Messiah, Maimonides' Messiah, can't legislate, he can still model his leadership on Moses in other ways. All right. To begin with, Maimonides' Messiah still has the power to interpret law. Moreover, his interpretation, will be considered authoritative and binding. And this follows naturally from his status as a prophet. His hermeneutic, right, the Messiah's hermeneutic, is God's hermeneutic. So regardless of how Jewish legal rulings have been understood up to his time, he will have the last word. Now, this is not legislative discretion in the full sense, but the power to interpret law comes close to the power to make it, an idea which was surely not lost on Maimonides, whose Mishnah Torah, as we know, bears the literal title, Second Torah, and who plainly saw himself in the lineage as Yehuda HaNasi, the codifier of the Mishnah, and Rav Ashi, who he took to be the redactor of the Talmud. Prudence, in Al-Farabi's sense, therefore plays a crucial role here too. The Messiah will use his interpretive authority to ensure that each mitzvah continues to fulfill one of its core purposes, in Maimonides' words, quote, imparting a belief, instilling a virtue, or curbing wrongdoing. Okay. At the same time, the Messiah will also need his imagination. To begin with, he'll need it for interpreting a different set of texts, those containing the Torah's narratives, concepts, and prescribed beliefs. Scripture's words, as we all know, are immutable in the sense that they are imprinted on ink, but in a larger sense, they are also ours to form, right? Their meaning strongly depends on the particular way that they're read and understood. As Maimonides puts it, quote, the portals of allegory are not closed in our faces. Nothing keeps us from interpreting texts freely. Now, Maimonides here is referring to the debate over the world's creation or eternality. And I want to focus on that for a minute because I think it's an especially good example of how imagination works as a tool for leadership, for philosophical leadership. Aristotle and many philosophers held that the world existed forever. The Torah, read plainly, teaches that it was created by God. But for Maimonides, no Torah passage, no matter how straightforward, is beyond the power of an imaginative reader to interpret as he would like. Maimonides writes, quote, it is not because the Torah says the world began that we shun eternalism. We could readily explain away these passages and affirm the world's eternity. So the bottom line of all scriptural interpretation for Maimonides is what reason teaches. As he puts it in a different context, choose the view you like. What the text says, or seems to say, is almost irrelevant because the text itself is not the point. The truth is. And what we think the truth is may change. In Maimonides' own time, the philosophical jury on eternalism was deadlocked, but he anticipates that someday one side might prevail, right? So the Messiah has to be trained in how to elicit different meanings from the Torah text itself, to harmonize it with the truth as it's known. To rule, in other words, the Messiah must be taught to read. And Maimonides, I think, saw the guide as his tutor. Maimonides also gives the Messiah a second and even more powerful way of using his imagination, and that is to create or reveal new prophecy. Prophets, for Maimonides, never prescribe new laws. Only the Torah via the oral law can do that. But they still have a powerful impact. Prophets homilize and chastise and inspire and reassure. They counsel kings, they share divine visions, and they make predictions about the future. In each of these ways, they profoundly shape their people's beliefs and practices. At the same time, prophetic language is not meant to be taken literally, but instead carefully peeled back, right, revealing the philosophical kernel behind the sublime poetry. For example, that's how Maimonides interprets Ezekiel's account of the chariot, right, as a symbolic representation of Neoplatonic philosophy. Prophecy is therefore the quintessential use of the imagination in Al-Farabi's sense. It's an ideal way to disseminate true beliefs to the masses. Maimonides probably anticipates that the Messiah will compose his own prophetic works. Indeed, he likely expects that the Messiah will follow what the guide itself teaches, providing the public, according to its intellectual development, with resources for navigating theological questions, the problem of evil, the reasons for the commandments, the meaning of human freedom, the nature of prophecy, providence, and divine knowledge. Okay. I want to conclude with a question that at least some of you might be asking, which is, if the guide was supposed to train the Messiah, where is he? Right? Why hasn't he come? Now, we could certainly find many practical reasons. It's rare to find a philosopher who's also a military leader. Jews, of course, were for centuries scattered and powerless and dispirited. The guide is rough sailing even for seasoned scholars. And many do not read the other philosophers like Al-Farabi, who Maimonides assigned as background. I think there are also philosophical reasons. Maimonides inhabited a Neoplatonic universe in which prophecy could be equated with philosophy because human reason itself was thought to participate in God, the emanation of the active intellect. His view of the Messiah makes sense in those terms. Moses could be thought to have reached the pinnacle of philosophy because philosophical truths were regarded as universal and constant, accessible to any human being. Of the proper nature and education, and then the Torah's laws and doctrines could be thought of as translating those truths in some way. But for many, Neoplatonism has become implausible. Divine emanation has ceased. Our reason has lost its tether to God. Philosophical truths are deeply contested. It no longer seems possible, therefore, to anticipate a Messiah on the model of Moses. So there's another possibility, I think, and that is that maybe we are asking the wrong question. In Maimonides' time, anticipating the Messianic age meant anticipating a Messiah, a singular human being who would heroically overthrow the current order, redeem his people, and lead humanity to a new age. The world has transformed. The bond between religion and state has been broken. Knowledge has been liberated from religious dogmatism. Individuals are free to cultivate themselves morally and intellectually. Philosophical contemplation is no longer the province of a select few. Human beings no longer want or need a tutelary state. These changes, however fragile and imperfectly realized, suggest that any messianic concept has to change with it. To this end, Maimonides' guide remains indispensable. The guide may not make the Messiah, but of course it can still enlighten us. We can no longer read the Torah as a coded text of philosophy. We can still read its laws, narratives, images, and concepts as reflecting moral facts, and its purpose is drawing a roadmap for a civilization and the individuals who constitute it to gain knowledge to the greatest possible degree. The world has changed. The Messiah's basic task has not. Perhaps it's now ours to put together. Thank you. That's it.
Sure. I think this is a moment we should all remember because we have heard something new, something revolutionary. We're not plodding over familiar disputes about what a certain text contains. We're really leaping ahead to new and creative ideas of what we can learn from the Guide to the Perplexed. It's wonderful to be able to have Charlie Lesch here as an exemplary of a new generation of Jewish political philosophy. Some of what you had to say at the end is in the chapter on Messianism in my book on justice. Much of it is in Al-Farabi, and most importantly, a lot of it is in the Guide to the Perplexed and the related texts by the Rambam. I would only see the importance of poetry and ritual as exemplifications of what imagination can accomplish in relating reason to the practical life of peoples, including our own people. Let's open it up for discussion. We just have a few minutes because I don't want to, please, JJ.
So the first comment, I think the reason the site hasn't come to that till now has to do with translation to English of the guide.
That's right.
Now we do.
Now it's only a matter of time.
So it's only a matter of time.
Because you used to be phrased in the speech, you've had it in our history, many messianic imposters.
Yeah.
We could perhaps infer from your presentation that we haven't had any messianic imposters, just poorly educated potential side. Unsuccessful side.
Unsuccessful and stuff. Well, so if we're following Maimonides' definition, then many of the people who saw themselves as potential messiahs would never really qualify them. Right? Because speaking of the individual, he refers to in the letter to the Epistle to Yemen, for example. He writes at one place that, oh, he has a reputation for little knowledge, I'm paraphrasing, but for little knowledge and meekness or something. It's the exact opposite of what Maimonides would think of the Messiah. Messiah has to be a great military charismatic leader, and he also has to be a philosopher, right? So I'm not also, I don't think that Maimonides, is a universalist in the sense that he believed that human beings had equal, intellectual capacity of philosophers. So it can't be that any given person could therefore become a Messiah. That's a thing.
I would say your claim is that the guy and Maimonides' other writings functions as education for a Messiah who already has the innate capacities to take advantage of such an expectation. Right.
It's very important to Maimonides that one have the God-given gift of a certain imagination, which depends on the structure of your brain, as Al-Farabi and Avicenna had both proved. Imagination is a physical capability that connects Maimonides to Halevi in ways which they are too often contrasted. That ethnicity is important, that poetic gift is important. But I think it's important, JJ, to recognize that Shabtai Tzvi deceived many people, including himself and Nathan of Gaza and others, into thinking that he was a Messiah. And some of that deception is very relevant. Maimonides mentions examples of people who wanted to be messiahs, but they lacked that extra little gift. And he's not thinking of them all as imposters. He's just thinking of them as people who didn't make the grade because they didn't have the special imagination. And I stress that imagination relates to poetry, which is the means, the Platonic means by which you put across these basic ideas so that they will be accepted and motivate large numbers of people who don't necessarily think philosophically. We should please go ahead.
Yeah. That
One, two, three.
Sorry, it's too historical of what there's over here. I'm curious that they would have say that. I'm sure as you're familiar, there are some things that there's a sort of identify the activization of the messianic idea as kind of the hallmark of Jewish modernity, magnetic causes, whether it's sort of a direct politicization, secularization, socialism, or emancipation, or sort of positively kind of neutralization. There's an apolitical approach with elevated movement. I guess what I would ask you is just, we don't need to, but we are to take sort of the activization, the sort of transfer of, and I think you're saying that I'm very much said that we should sort of look actively to cultivate messianism, of course, in a very religious way, tends to kind of, I guess, challenge or complicate periodization of people consider it. What is said about the mind place in kind of finding genealogy to do with heredity?
Oh, that's a big question. Well, I think the way that I'll respond to that is just to say, I think that one of the reasons why the messianic idea persists, and not only in explicitly religious contexts, but also in ostensibly secular contexts, is that there is something just structurally powerful. I think about the notion that, well, history seems to be going along, this route, and it seems hopeless. It seems like the trajectory is, impossible to stop. What messianism, as opposed to kind of Hegelian view of history, that envisions is a rupture. It envisions that something is going to come from outside of history and somehow change everything, or kind of split or break everything. And so I think it's unsurprising. I don't want to, let's say that this is the structural universal or something like that, but I do think that in the context of Western thought, it is something that keeps reappearing because it has that kind of power of a hope against hope. Again, when things seem like they're beyond the capacity of human beings to change or exercise agency, messianism gives people the feeling that actually that things really are within their power and agency. And then it can take different forms, right? There's ethical messianism, political messianism, more pietistic forms of messianism, etc. But I think the basic structure.
There was another person here. Do you still have a question?
Yeah, I don't have a question, but thank you. It's really wonderful. At one point you say prophetic language is not to be taken literally, and I'm thinking about poetry and the metaphor of the poet in romantic poetry, for example, as a prophet, and of course in modern Hebrew literature, national poetry about the poet as the prophet.
Yeah.
So I'm also asking about, can the poet be like the Messiah, right? Like how we can jump from the prophet to the Messiah and
Gotta be
but
military,
also, I would try
victorious military leader as well, though.
Yeah.
I also want to add that there is also like a special view of this redemptive, like in relation to what you said of this redemptive paradigm, right? That usually they lead to like dystopia, right? To the catastrophe there. So I was just wondering.
Right, yeah, so I'll take these as two separate questions, just in response to the second one first. I think that one of the main concerns we might have about messianism, especially in any kind of political form of messianism, is, what we associate with Kierkegaard, theological suspension of the ethical. The messianic end somehow then justifies running roughshod, against all kinds of norms and kind of moral boundaries and so forth, because the end is what matters. You see manifestations of that, again, both religious and secular. So I think that is deeply problematic. I think that Maimonides has ways of painting that, avoiding it, or because that the law is never annulled. I think that's very important. The law remains. On the first question, so I think poetry can serve different functions in this way. I mean, for Maimonides, though, for the Messiah in particular, and also for Moses, it's important that the poetic imagery is a translation of philosophical ideas. Right? In other words, we might think of poetry today as in part evoking forms of human experience which would be dulled if we were to try to put them in the form of a treatise. Yes, I walked through the woods on a snowy day. Like, okay, that's nice. But you read Robert Frost, that's much more powerful, right? But I think that for Maimonides, the way that Glenn will correct me, but it seems like the primary function of poetry is again the kind of dissemination of philosophical ideas to people who would not necessarily care for them, rather than the evocation of experience, of human experience for its own sake.
Lovely. Ken had a point, and I think that'll have to be the last one for the moment, and because we do. Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, well, you're right when you said at the end, philosophy has changed. It's what Maimonides believed in the possibility of demonstration, particularly with the existence of the when you said that philosophy, I thought of it for a moment, about Hillary Clinton, who said, what in the history of philosophy has ever been demonstrated? We don't look at philosophy demonstrating things in the way that the medievals did. And that raises the question whether there even could be a Messiah in the Maimonidean sense of the term.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot of the unwritten part of this paper, which may be a separate paper, actually, is thinking about exactly this issue, which is to say, if we think that what the Torah is, as Maimonides, I think did, which is to say a translation of philosophical ideas which Moses came to, as any person can come to. What happens when we lose that belief, that confidence that any person could come to this kind of elaborate system of philosophical ideas on their own? So as I look to concluding, again, very much still thinking about this, it strikes me that there are still basic evidence that perhaps one could not prove, but at least kind of arrive at kind of conclude actually. Among them, the existence of God, the existence of certain kind of moral factors, even some kind of basic cosmological things. But that does deflate a little bit what it is that people try to ascribe to what Moses made. Therefore,
You have God's existence accepted, right?
We should we should go on. I will respect. I remember Hillary very well, and he didn't know Alexander Raphidius very well, because in the history of philosophy, it was proved to the great disadvantage of the Stoics that you can't have two physical things in the same place at the same time. One of the great demonstrations, it's not quite the demonstration of the existence of God, which is more portentous, but there have been things in the history of philosophy that have been proved, and that's one of them. And it's due to the man with the wonderful name, Alexander Raphidius. Thank you so much for that.